Here's a fact that stops most people in their tracks the first time they actually hear it explained properly. If you have blue eyes, there is no blue pigment anywhere inside them. Not a trace, not a single molecule. In the entire history of the human species, nobody has ever actually produced blue eye pigment because that pigment simply does not exist in human biology at all. Every eye, color on the planet, from the darkest brown to the palest Arctic blue, is ultimately built from just one single pigment, a brownish substance called melanin, the exact same pigment that colors your skin and hair. Blue eyes are not colored by pigment in the way almost everyone assumes. They are, in a very real and physically precise sense, an optical illusion, produced by the exact same basic physics that makes the sky above your head appear blue, even though the sky itself contains no blue coloring agent whatsoever. And here is the part that turns this from a simple fun fact into something genuinely startling. Geneticists have traced nearly every blue-eyed person alive on Earth today back to a single common ancestor, one specific individual who lived somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, whose own DNA carried a brand new genetic mutation that had never existed in any human being before them. Every blue eye you have ever seen, on every person you have ever met, on every actor in every movie, on every photograph of every blue-eyed celebrity, traces back, at the genetic level, to that one single person. This is the real, deeply researched story of exactly how that happened, and exactly what your DNA is actually doing every single time it produces a pair of blue eyes. To understand where blue eyes actually come from, you first need to understand the physical structure of the iris, the colored ring surrounding your pupil. The iris contains specialized cells that produce melanin, and the total amount of that pigment those cells deposit is the single biggest factor determining where your eyes fall on the overall color spectrum. A heavily pigmented iris, packed densely with melanin throughout its front layers, absorbs most incoming light and reflects back a rich brown color, the most common eye color on the planet by an overwhelming margin. But when an iris contains very little melanin, something else entirely takes over. A phenomenon called Tyndall scattering, named after the 19th century physicist who first studied it. And it is precisely the same basic physical principle responsible for the color of the daytime sky. Shorter wavelengths of light, the blue end of the visible spectrum, get scattered far more efficiently by small particles and microscopic structures than longer wavelengths do. In a nearly melanin-free iris, that scattered blue light bounces back out toward anyone looking at your eyes, creating the visual appearance of blue, a color generated entirely by physics rather than by any actual blue substance sitting inside your eye. Take away the atmosphere and the sky goes black, exactly as astronauts describe seeing from orbit. Take away even the minimal remaining melanin in a blue iris, and you would be looking at something closer to the pale pink of an eye with no pigment at all, the kind sometimes seen in individuals with albinism. Since, without any melanin whatsoever, the pale color of underlying blood vessels can show through instead, the genetic machinery controlling how much melanin an iris ultimately produces centers on two specific genes sitting directly next to each other on human chromosome 15, named OCA2 and HER2. OCA2 does the actual biological work, producing a protein, commonly called the P protein, that plays a critical role in the internal cellular machinery responsible for manufacturing and properly depositing melanin within pigment-producing cells. But OCA2 does not operate independently. It needs to be switched on, and the specific intensity of that activation is controlled by a regulatory region sitting inside its neighboring gene, HER2, functioning essentially as a genetic dimmer switch. The single most extensively studied genetic variant controlling this switch carries the technical label rs29138-2, located deep within an intron of the HER2 gene, sitting a full 21,000 base pairs upstream from OCA2's own promoter region, yet still capable of reaching across that distance to directly control how active OCA2 becomes. Laboratory experiments using cultured melanocyte cells, the actual pigment-producing cells found in skin and eyes, have demonstrated exactly how this works at a molecular level. One version of that regulatory sequence allows a specific transcription factor to bind efficiently, encouraging a physical looping of the chromosome that brings the... This is where the story turns from interesting genetics into something considerably more startling, a discovery that ranks among the most genuinely remarkable findings in modern human population genetics. Research led by geneticist Hans Eyberg at the University of Copenhagen examined DNA collected from blue-eyed individuals spread across an enormous geographic range, stretching from Scandinavia all the way to Jordan and Turkey, populations separated by thousands of miles and, in many cases, by thousands of years of independent history. What Eyberg's team found defied any reasonable expectation of pure coincidence. Essentially, every single blue-eyed person they examined, regardless of where on the map they lived, carried the exact same specific version of that HERE2 regulatory variant, an amount of genetic uniformity that simply does not occur through random independent mutation happening over and over again in separate, unrelated populations. Random mutations of this kind are individually rare events, and finding the identical genetic change repeated independently across such a geographically dispersed sample would represent a statistical near impossibility. The far more plausible, and now widely accepted explanation is that this mutation happened exactly once in a single individual at some specific point in human history, and every blue-eyed person alive today descends from that one original person, carrying forward a copy of that same ancient genetic accident through an unbroken chain of inheritance stretching across hundreds of generations. Iberg himself described the implication of the finding directly, noting that it means all blue-eyed humans are genetically linked to a single common ancestor, an individual in whom this specific mutation first occurred, and then, through the ordinary mechanics of reproduction and population growth over subsequent millennia, spread outward to become the ancestral root of every blue eye currently blinking somewhere on the planet. Pinning down exactly when that founder mutation actually occurred required additional genetic detective work, examining not just the specific mutated variant itself, but the surrounding stretch of DNA inherited alongside it, since genetic material tends to get shuffled and reshuffled a little more with each passing generation as chromosomes recombine. By measuring how much that surrounding genetic material had already been broken up and reshuffled across different blue-eyed populations, researchers were able to estimate roughly how many generations had elapsed since the original mutation first appeared, arriving at an estimated window somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. That time frame places the origin of blue eyes considerably later than many people might assume. Well, after the earliest waves of modern humans had already spread across Europe, meaning that for tens of thousands of years before that mutation ever appeared, every single human being on Earth, everywhere, without exception, had brown eyes. Blue eyes are not some ancient, deeply rooted human trait stretching back to our earliest African origins. They are a genuinely recent evolutionary innovation, younger than the invention of agriculture in some regions of the world, younger than the earliest known writing systems, a genetic accident that happened to just one person sometime around the dawn of recorded human civilization. Why would a single mutation like this, one that provides no obvious survival advantage and, if anything, slightly reduces the eye's natural protection against ultraviolet light, manage to spread so successfully and so widely across an entire continent's population? And within just a few thousand years, population geneticists studying ancient DNA have found a genuinely compelling clue buried in the statistical signature left behind at this specific genomic location. A 2015 study analyzing ancient European genomes detected an unmistakable signal of active, positive natural selection, operating specifically at the HERC2 and OCA2 eye color locus, with a statistical significance so extreme, a p-value of 3.2 times 10 to the negative 11th power, that researchers can say with very high confidence something was actively and powerfully favoring the spread of lighter eyes throughout ancient European populations, rather than the trait simply drifting through the gene pool by pure random chance the way a truly neutral trait typically would. Exactly what force was doing, that favoring remains a genuinely open, actively debated scientific question. The leading hypothesis centers on simple sexual selection, the straightforward evolutionary logic that in an ancestral population where dark brown eyes were the universal norm, an individual carrying this brand new, visually striking light-eyed mutation would have stood out immediately and dramatically from literally everyone around them. If that novelty, translated into even a modest, consistent mating preference, sustained patiently across hundreds of generations, that preference alone could plausibly compound into precisely the kind of strong, statistically detectable selection signal researchers have now found preserved directly in ancient DNA. Other researchers have proposed additional explanations, including possible links between the same genetic region and other physiological traits that may have offered some more direct survival benefit, though as of the most recent published research, evolutionary biologists have not yet fully, conclusively settled which explanation, or which combination of explanations, actually accounts for blue eyes' surprisingly rapid historical spread. The ancient DNA record has also delivered a genuinely startling twist to this story, one that upends a popular intuitive assumption most people carry about how European physical traits supposedly evolved together as a single, linked package. In 2014, researchers led by Carlos Lalueza Fox at the Spanish National Research Council successfully sequenced the genome of a roughly 7,000-year-old Mesolithic hunter-gatherer known as La Braña 1, whose remains had been recovered from a cave in the mountains of northern Spain. The genetic results genuinely surprised the research team. La Braña 1 carried the low-activity HERC2 variant associated with blue eyes, meaning this ancient hunter-gatherer almost certainly had blue or light-colored eyes. But his DNA simultaneously revealed notably dark skin, closer in overall pigmentation to modern populations from sub-Saharan Africa than to the pale skin typically, and incorrectly, assumed to travel hand-in-hand with blue eyes. Aloysia Fox described the finding candidly, admitting the team had certain expectations going into the research and that most of those expectations turned out to be completely wrong. A remarkably similar combination turned up again in 2018, when researchers at University College London and the Natural History Museum sequenced the DNA of Cheddarman, Britain's oldest nearly complete human skeleton, dated to roughly 10,000 years old and originally discovered in Somerset's Gough's Cave back in 1903. Cheddarman's genome echoed Labragna's almost exactly, showing blue eyes paired with skin pigmentation. Researchers described as dark to black, a combination that, far from being some rare, isolated fluke, appeared genuinely typical of an entire population of ancient hunter-gatherers, now referred to as Western hunter-gatherers, a population whose DNA still contributes measurably, if only partially, to modern British and broader Northern European ancestry today. Taken together, these findings strongly suggest that light-colored eyes actually evolved considerably earlier and along a genuinely separate evolutionary track than widespread light skin did among European populations, directly overturning the tidy popular narrative that both traits emerged together as a single coordinated adaptation to Europe's lower sunlight levels. Blue eyes are not evenly distributed across the modern world, and their geographic concentration tells its own fascinating story about human migration and population history. Globally, blue eyes remain a genuine minority trait, found in somewhere around 8 to 10% of the entire world's population, a figure that seems almost paradoxical to anyone who spends most of their time around European or European-descended populations, where blue eyes can feel considerably more common than that global figure suggests. That perception gap exists precisely because blue eyes concentrate, overwhelmingly in specific pockets of the world rather than spreading evenly everywhere. In countries like Estonia, Finland, and Latvia, blue or light-colored eyes appear in a genuinely overwhelming majority of the population, with some regional surveys placing local prevalence as high as 80 or even 90%, a level of concentration that traces directly back to those populations' particularly close genetic relationship to the specific ancient populations where the original HERK2 mutation first spread and took hold most successfully. In the United States, meanwhile, blue eye prevalence has been measurably declining for more than a century, a trend multiple independent surveys and demographic studies have documented consistently. Various estimates place blue eyes at roughly half of the American population in the early 20th century, a figure that has fallen substantially since with more recent surveys, including a widely cited 2014 American Academy of Ophthalmology poll, placing the current figure closer to 27% of American adults, and some more recent estimates suggesting an even steeper decline among younger generations. Specifically, that decline reflects ongoing demographic shifts within the American population over the past century, including substantially increased immigration from regions of the world where the original HER2 founder mutation never spread as widely, gradually diluting the concentration of that specific ancient genetic variant within the broader national population pool over successive generations. Beyond simple visual appearance, the same reduced melanin that produces blue eyes carries real documented physiological trade-offs worth understanding honestly, rather than glossing over for the sake of a purely feel-good story. Melanin does more than simply color tissue. It also provides genuine physical protection against ultraviolet radiation, meaning eyes with less of it are correspondingly more vulnerable to certain risks. Ophthalmology research has documented that blue-eyed individuals experience measurably higher rates of photophobia, meaning heightened sensitivity and discomfort in bright light conditions, precisely because there is less pigment available to help absorb and filter incoming light before it reaches the eye's more sensitive internal structures. Multiple published studies have also identified blue eyes as an independent risk factor for certain specific eye conditions, including a modestly elevated risk of ocular melanoma, a rare but serious form of eye cancer, along with some research suggesting a possible association with increased vulnerability to age-related macular degeneration, one of the leading causes of vision loss in older adults. None of this means blue eyes are dangerous or that blue-eyed individuals face some dramatically elevated overall health risk, but it does mean the same genetic trade-off responsible for that striking pale coloring, reduced melanin, carries real, measurable, if generally modest, biological consequences alongside it. Exactly the kind of complete, honest picture that separates genuine science communication from purely decorative trivia. One particularly persistent piece of folklore deserves direct, careful examination too, the popular belief that blue-eyed people can see better than others in low light or nighttime conditions. This idea has circulated widely enough that it counts as genuine common knowledge in many circles, and there is at least a plausible physical mechanism behind it worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing. Outright, since reduced iris pigment does mean marginally more light passes through and around the iris structure itself, rather than being absorbed by it. But rigorous vision research has not found convincing evidence that this translates into any meaningful, measurable, real-world advantage in actual night vision performance, and the same reduced pigmentation that theoretically permits slightly more incidental light. Through also comes with a previously mentioned downside of significantly increased sensitivity and discomfort in bright conditions, meaning any theoretical dim light benefit trades off directly against a genuine, well-documented disadvantage in bright daylight or glare, a classic biological trade-off, rather than a simple, uncomplicated superpower. Blue eyes also carry a genuinely interesting cultural and psychological dimension that researchers studying human perception have examined directly, separate entirely from the underlying genetics. Multiple studies on facial attractiveness and social perception have found that blue eyes are frequently high traits in the minds of observers, including youthfulness, openness, and trustworthiness, associations that appear consistently enough across different studies and cultural contexts to suggest something more systematic than pure random chance or simple aesthetic preference. Some researchers studying this phenomenon have speculated that these perceptions may connect back to the same evolutionary selection story driving the trait's original spread thousands of years ago, since a visually novel, conspicuous trait that once attracted mating interest in ancestral populations could plausibly have left behind lingering psychological associations that persist in diluted form within modern perception and cultural preference even now, though this particular connection remains considerably more speculative than the hard genetic and selection signal evidence discussed earlier. Whatever the deeper explanation, the practical, observable effect is well documented. Blue eyes appear, disproportionately often in advertising, film and media specifically because of their strong visual impact and the positive associations audiences tend to project onto them, a modern commercial echo of what may have originally been a genuine evolutionary advantage playing out in mate selection among ancient European populations. For a genuinely different, far more applied application, one that fuses cutting-edge genetics directly with modern computational and machine learning techniques. Forensic DNA phenotyping is a rapidly expanding field within forensic genetics, specifically focused on predicting a person's likely physical appearance, including eye color, directly from DNA evidence recovered at a crime scene, even in cases where no matching suspect exists in any criminal database. The most widely validated tool in this space, called IrisPlex, and its expanded successor, HirisPlex-S, examine a carefully selected panel of genetic variants and calculate individual statistical probabilities for specific eye color categories based on exactly which versions of those variants a given DNA sample carries. Independent validation testing of the original IrisPlex system demonstrated remarkably high predictive accuracy, specifically for distinguishing blue from brown eyes, precisely because the underlying genetic signal at the HERC2 locus is so strong and so consistently reliable across different populations, a direct practical consequences of that same single ancient founder mutation being shared so uniformly among blue-eyed individuals worldwide. These prediction systems rely on statistical and machine learning-based modeling approaches, trained against enormous reference data sets, linking known genetic variants to directly observed, verified physical traits, then applied to unknown crime scene samples to generate genuinely useful investigative leads for police departments working otherwise unidentifiable cases. Forensic scientists have specifically described this kind of DNA-based prediction as functioning like a biological witness, in certain circumstances providing more objectively reliable physical description information than notoriously unreliable human eyewitness testimony can offer, connecting a genetic mutation that first appeared in a single Neolithic-era human being directly to 21st century criminal investigations, solved with the direct assistance of modern statistical and computational modeling. All of this genetic complexity carries one more practical consequence that catches many new parents genuinely by surprise: the fact that eye color inheritance is considerably less predictable than the simple, tidy, dominant, and recessive diagrams taught in introductory biology classes might suggest. For decades, popular understanding treated eye color as a straightforward single-gene trait, brown fully dominant over blue, the kind of oversimplified model implying two blue-eyed parents could never, under any circumstances, produce a child with darker eyes. Modern genetics has thoroughly overturned that picture. Because eye color actually results from the combined interacting effects of OCA2, HERC2, and more than a dozen additional modifying genes scattered elsewhere across the human genome, geneticists now routinely caution that predicting a future child's exact eye color from parental eye color alone is genuinely unreliable. and that two blue-eyed parents can, in certain documented cases, still produce a child with green, hazel, or even brown eyes, depending on exactly which combination of modifying variants each parent happens to be silently carrying without either parent's own eye color ever revealing those hidden genetic possibilities. That same underlying complexity also explains why nearly all babies, regardless of their eventual adult eye color, are born with comparatively light, grayish blue eyes, since melanin production in the iris typically continues ramping up gradually over the first 6 to 12 months after birth, meaning a newborn's true final eye color often cannot be confidently determined until sometime well into their first year of life. Put all of these pieces together, the physics of light scattering that colors both the sky and your iris, the precise two-gene regulatory switch sitting on chromosome 15, the single shared ancestral mutation traceable back to one specific person who lived somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years ago, the statistically powerful evolutionary selection pressure, still not fully explained by science, the startling ancient DNA evidence of dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherers roaming prehistoric Europe thousands of years before anyone expected, and the modern machine learning-powered forensic tools now built directly on top of this same genetic foundation, and blue eyes stop looking like a simple cosmetic accident of birth. They become something considerably richer, the visible, physical signature written directly into your DNA by one genuinely improbable mutation in one specific ancient human being, carried forward faithfully and completely unchanged across hundreds of generations, spreading from that single original person all the way to every single blue-eyed person alive on Earth today. The next time you look into a pair of blue eyes, yours or anyone else's, you are looking directly at the living, breathing genetic legacy of one single human ancestor, and at exactly the same basic physics that colors the open sky stretching above your head.